This is part 2 of a video series I'm doing on the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. In the previous video, I looked at historical methodology, in other words, what I'm going to be doing to arrive at my conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead. I talked about the criteria of authenticity, such as the criterion of multiple attestation, the criterion of embarrassment, the criterion of dissimilarity, the criterion of early attestation, etc. I told the viewers that they ought to be willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads and not let your feelings or your distaste of Christianity get in the way. And now that I am done with that, I'm going to look at the evidence for the first minimal fact in our case, Jesus' death by crucifixion. Obviously, this series is about the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, but you have to have a death before you can have a resurrection. I shall defend the resurrection, as I said in the previous video, by means of a two-step process. First, I'll establish the data, and 2, I'll argue that only a miraculous resurrection can best account for the data. In the case of the former, I will be using facts that meet 2 criteria. They are very well evidenced, and nearly all scholars who study the subject accept them as true, even the skeptical non-Christian scholars. And in this video, I will give the evidence for that first minimal fact, that Jesus died by crucifixion. So let's jump into it. Reason 1. Jesus' death by crucifixion is multiply attested. Jesus' death by Roman crucifixion is overwhelmingly multiply attested. It is mentioned in 4 secular sources, the Jewish Talmud, the Synoptic Gospels, John's Gospel, and Paul's Epistles. Let's look at that first source. Source 1 is Josephus. The first century Jewish historian named Flavius Josephus, who lived from 37 to 100 AD, wrote about Jesus' crucifixion in his book Antiquities of the Jews in Book 18. Josephus wrote, quote, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day." End quote. Here we have a 1st century non-Christian historian saying that a man named Jesus existed, drew a crowd of people who listened to his teachings, but was killed by Roman crucifixion under the governor Pontius Pilate at the request of some of the principal men among us, which we can infer to be the Jewish Sanhedrin. This is historical evidence for the crucifixion of Jesus coming from a source with no theological axe to grind. Now, some skeptics will object that this passage, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, really isn't good historical evidence for the crucifixion because the passage seems to have been interpolated by a Christian scribe. I would agree that it has clearly been interpolated by a Christian scribe, as would most scholars. The Church Father Origen informs us that Josephus did not believe Jesus to be the Messiah. So it would be highly unlikely that he would say things like, "if it be lawful to call him a man," for that sentence implies that Jesus was more than human, or "he was the Christ," as this is an explicit declaration that Jesus is the Messiah, which is a statement that only a Christian would make. What's worse is that near the very end of this passage, Josephus says that Jesus rose from the dead according to the divine prophets. Again, only Christians believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Josephus, being a non-Christian, would never make these statements. This passage was obviously altered by a scribe who did believe these things, a Christian scribe. But, while I agree that the Testimonium Flavianum has been interpolated to some degree, I don't think it follows that we can't use the passage as extra-biblical evidence for the death of Jesus. The majority of scholars today hold the position that the Testimonium Flavianum was only partially interpolated. That is to say, most of the passage is legitimate. It's not like a Christian scribe made the entire Testimonium Flavianum up. but only certain phrases were inserted or altered by a Christian scribe. There are two primary arguments that historians give that I find compelling for adopting this partial interpolation view. The first argument is that when you remove the obvious Christian additions, the passage remains coherent. Christopher Price wrote, quote, "Perhaps the most important factor leading most scholars to accept the partial authenticity position is that a substantial part of the TF reflects Josephine language and style. Moreover, when the obvious Christian glosses, which are rich in New Testament terms and language not found in the core, are removed or restored to their original, the remaining core passage is coherent and flows well. We can be confident that there was a minimal reference to Jesus, because once the clearly Christian sections are removed, the rest makes good grammatical and historical sense. The peculiarly Christian words are parenthetically connected to the narrative, hence they are grammatically free and could have easily been inserted by a Christian. These sections are also disruptive, and when they are removed, the flow of thought is improved and smoother," end quote. I think that Price is right. Compare the clearly interpolated version of the Testimonium Flavianum, which I just showed, to this version, which has all of the clearly Christian confessional statements omitted. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, and the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day. You can see that the flow of thought isn't bothered by the removal of these obvious Christian additions. How often is it that you can erase whole sentences from a paragraph and still have that paragraph make perfect sense? Not very often. On this basis, therefore, it's highly probable that there was an original passage about Jesus' crucifixion in this portion of Josephus' writing, and it did not include phrases that expressed belief that he was the Messiah and that he rose from the dead in fulfillment of prophecy. The second argument for the partial authenticity theory is the reference to James, the brother of Jesus. The reference to James, the brother of Jesus, suggests an earlier reference to Jesus. Later on in Josephus' writings, Josephus makes a reference to Jesus' brother James and records his martyrdom at the hands of the Jewish Sanhedrin. While the Testimonium Flavianum is hotly debated, I don't know of any scholar who debates the validity of Josephus' reference to James. Most scholars are on board and say, yes, Josephus' reference to James is legitimate. The reference to James's martyrdom increases the likelihood of the Testimonium Flavianum being legitimate for this reason. When Josephus mentions the killing of James, he says that James is the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ. The so-called Christ. And he says that without any further explanation. All that Josephus says about James is that he's the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ. In the passage about James, Josephus doesn't go into any explanation of who Jesus was, what he did, no claims of him dying and rising from the dead, no mention of any miracles, nothing. The only thing Josephus says about James is that he's Jesus' brother. What this implies is that Josephus presupposed that his readers already knew who he was referring to. But why would Josephus make such an assumption? Well, it's possible that Christianity had spread so much by then that it would have been common knowledge that there was a man named Jesus who was believed to be the Messiah who got crucified. That's one possibility. But another possibility is that Josephus assumed this knowledge because he already mentioned Jesus and said, yeah, he was a good teacher, he drew a lot of people to himself, but the principal men among us brought charges to Pontius Pilate and asked to have him crucified, and he was. That it would make sense that Josephus would presuppose that his readers already knew who James was talking about if he had already mentioned him earlier in his writings. There are other arguments that support the partial authenticity theory, but I don't have time to get into all of them. But I think these are really two good reasons that you can remove all of the Christian editions, and not only is Josephus's writings not only is it still coherent, but according to Christopher Price, it's actually improved. The grammar is improved. The flow of thought is improved. This makes it highly likely that the version that I put up on screen a few minutes ago, without the Christian editions, is what was originally in there. The whole thing was not interpolated. Only certain phrases were put in by a Christian scribe to try to get people to believe in Jesus. And the second reason is that Josephus mentions Jesus again in the context of James's martyrdom, and it's possible that the reason he assumed the knowledge of who Jesus was is because Christianity spread across the Jewish world by then, but I think an equally likely explanation is because Josephus already mentioned him. There was no need to go into that detail. So I think the Testimonium Flavianum can be used as evidence for Jesus' existence and for his death by crucifixion at Pontius Pilate. But even if we disregarded Josephus, we would still have multiple attestation, as you'll see later on in this video. Let's look at the second source, Tacitus. Tacitus was a Roman historian writing in the early 2nd century. In the 15th volume of his work, Annals, Tacitus recounts the horrible burning down of Rome by Emperor Nero, and mentions how he tried to get the suspicions off of himself and onto the Christians by unleashing a terrible persecution against them. It is in this passage that he makes a reference to Jesus' crucifixion. The Annals of Tacitus dates to AD 115. Tacitus writes, quote, Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. That's from Cornelius Tacitus' Annals, 1544. Source 3, Mara bar Serapion. Mara bar Serapion was a Syriac Stoic philosopher in the Roman province of Syria. At some point he was arrested, and while in prison, he wrote a letter to his son. In this letter, he mentions how wise teachers who were persecuted and killed for their teachings were eventually avenged by God. He rhetorically asked what the Athenians gained from putting Socrates to death, and then mentioned how famine and plague came upon them, for example. As for Jesus, Mara wrote, quote, What did the Jews gain from murdering their wise king? It was after that their kingdom was abolished. End quote. About this passage, Josh and Sean McDowell write, quote, Though Mara never uses Jesus' name, we can be certain he is referring to him because no one else at that point in history would fulfill the requirements of being known as a wise king who was killed by the Jews shortly before they were driven from the land. Jesus is obviously in view. End quote. Now let's look at source 4, Lucian of Samosata. Lucian of Samosata was a 2nd century Greek satirist. In one of his works, he wrote of the early Christians as follows, quote, The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. End quote. This is from Lucian of Samosata from the book The Passing Peregrinus. I do not know how to pronounce that word, and I am not going to try. Source 5, the Talmud. Dr. Gary Habermas explains that, quote, The Jews handed down a large amount of oral tradition from generation to generation. This material was organized according to subject matter by Rabbi Akiba before his death in AD 135. His work was then revised by his student, Rabbi Meir. The project was completed around AD 200 by Rabbi Judah and is known as the Mishnah. Ancient commentary on the Mishnah was called the Gemaras. The combination of the Mishnah and the Gemaras form the Talmud. It would be expected that the most reliable information about Jesus from the Talmud would come from the earliest period of compilation, AD 70 to 200, known as the Tanaitic period, end quote. A very significant quotation is found in Sanhedrin 43a, dating from just this early period. It says, quote, "On the eve of the Passover, Yeshu was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, 'He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf.' But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover," end quote. As you may know, Jesus is the Greek name for Joshua, which is transliterated from Yeshua, and Yeshu is short for Yeshua, just as Josh is short for Joshua. Although the Talmud was not officially comprised until about 500 years after the first century, the material contained in the Talmud, i.e. the Mishnah and the Gemaras, dates earlier than that. And the material about Jesus in the Talmud dates early enough for us to consider it trustworthy material when it reports about him. Now, this passage of the Talmud says that Jesus, Yeshu, was hanged on the eve of the Passover. Now, lest you read this anachronistically, allow me to point out that hanged in this context does not mean our modern notion of tying a noose around someone's neck and then hanging them from a tree or other high place. In the first century, when people would talk about people being crucified, they would use the term hanged. He was hung on a tree. He was hung on a cross. He died by hanging. And we can see this in the New Testament. If you read verses like Galatians 3:13 and Luke 23:39, you see that it talks about Jesus having been hanged. That's what they called crucifixion. Source 6, the Gospel of Mark. Everyone knows that the Synoptic Gospels, i.e. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, refer to the crucifixion of Jesus, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this source. But I will clarify one thing, though. Throughout this series, you will see that sometimes I treat the Synoptics together as a single source, and sometimes I don't. Now, when I treat them as a single source, the reason I do this is because most New Testament scholars believe that Matthew and Luke, Mark was written first, and then Matthew and Luke, they took a lot of their material from Mark. And I mean, there's pretty good evidence for this. When you read some of the parallel accounts between Mark and Matthew, or Matthew and Luke, they read verbatim. It's just like Luke had a copy of the New Testament, or a copy of Mark right there, and he was kind of like looking over while he was jotting things down. I mean, but sometimes you find stuff in Luke that is not in either Matthew or Mark. Sometimes you find stuff that is in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. When this happens, scholars say, oh, this is probably coming from a source called Q. And sometimes Matthew includes things that neither Luke or Mark don't. So depending on the narrative, depending on what the author is talking about, sometimes we have good reason to believe Mark, Matthew, Luke are independent of each other. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes, because obviously if Matthew includes material that's not in Mark, he couldn't have been copying it from Mark. If it's not in Mark, he couldn't have copied it from Mark. He had to get it from somewhere else. So, just with that little informational footnote out of the way, let's move on to source 7, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. I do believe that Matthew and Luke are working from a source independent of Mark when it comes to the Passion narrative. And why do I think that? Well, one reason is that Luke 23 says that one of the thieves who was crucified with Jesus repented and asked Jesus to remember him when Jesus entered into his kingdom. We all know this part. Lord, remember me when you enter your kingdom. And Jesus says, Amen, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. I just love that. It warms my heart. But this detail is not mentioned by Mark. Mark doesn't mention the thieves talking to Jesus at all. So this suggests that Luke is relying on a different source. Matthew 27 also mentions the thieves, albeit he omits the repentance of the one. So this suggests that maybe whatever source Luke was working on, Matthew may have been working on that same source. Q? I don't know. Additionally, Luke records a whole paragraph of Jesus while he's walking to the cross. He's speaking to the daughters of Jerusalem. See Luke chapter 23, verses 27 to 32. This is completely absent from Mark's Passion narrative. Therefore, Luke cannot be drawing on Mark as a source here. Source 8, the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John, likewise, tells us that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. And most scholars believe that John was writing independently of the other three Gospels. You know the reason for that? It's just because John includes so much material that's not in the synoptics. So I'm treating John as an independent source here. Source 9, the Epistles of Paul. Paul's epistles mention the crucifixion of Jesus. See, for example, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3, and Philippians chapter 2. In all, we have at least 9 early sources that state that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. 4 of those sources are secular in nature: Josephus, Tacitus, Mara bar Serapion, and Lucian of Samosata. One of those sources is a non-Christian Jewish source, the Talmud, and 4 of those sources are from the New Testament. According to the criterion of multiple attestation, this makes it extremely, extremely probable that Jesus' death on a Roman cross at the hands of Pontius Pilate was a real event of history. The criterion of multiple attestation says that if you find any event mentioned in 2 or more independent sources, it makes it more likely that that event occurred. This is because the more and more independent sources an event is mentioned in, the less and less likely it is to be made up. Think about it. How likely is it that 9 independent sources all made up the same fictional story? 9 independent sources all made up the same fictional event and treated it as though it were a historical event? Do you honestly expect me to believe that 9 independent writers all just happened to make up the same thing? Well, guess what? Christ mythers do expect us to believe that. They believe the crucifixion of Jesus didn't happen because they don't even think Jesus was a real historical person. They expect us to believe that 9 independent writers all made up the same event and treat it as history. The whole of the first century was in on it. All the writers of the first century was in on it. No, I don't think so. Jesus' death by Roman crucifixion is multiply attested, and that makes it extremely probable that the event occurred. If this criterion of authenticity were the only one this minimal fact passed, it would be enough to conclude that it happened. Paul Meyer, retired distinguished professor of ancient history at Western Michigan University, said, quote, "Many facts in the ancient world are established on one source. 2 or 3 sources often make an event impregnable," end quote. 2 sources, you can't beat it. That's how source material works in ancient history. Paul Meyer of Western Michigan University says 2 sources make an historical event impregnable. But we don't have 2 sources here, we have 9. Reason 2. Jesus' crucifixion is enemy attested. Moreover, not only is Jesus' death by crucifixion multiply attested in 9 independent sources, but it's also enemy attested. Those who are your enemies are not likely to say things that help your cause. Those who are your enemies are not likely going to say good things about you. If they're going to lie, they're going to be to make you look bad or to hurt your cause. We have enemy attestation when it comes to Jesus' crucifixion. Neither Tacitus nor Lucian of Samosata were friendly to Christianity. In Tacitus' account, he calls Christianity a pernicious superstition. Lucian was ridiculing Christians in the very same passage in which he affirms that Jesus died by crucifixion. And the Jewish Talmud accused Jesus of leading Israel astray by sorcery. So in addition to multiple attestation in 9 independent sources, we have enemy attestation in 3 of those sources. Reason 3, the principle of historical fit. The principle of historical fit comes into play here because we know for a fact from the writings of ancient first-century authors like Josephus, Tacitus, and even from archaeological findings such as the Johannine discovery from 1975, that Romans crucified people back in the 1st century. And as we'll see later in this series, one of the reasons that people were crucified was in claiming to be the Messiah. Jesus being crucified on the grounds of claiming to be the Messiah fits right in with what we know of Roman executions. Reason 4. Only women had the guts to stick with Jesus in his final hours. If you were making up a story of any kind, you most likely wouldn't depict yourself, your friends, or people you respected in a bad way. If you were going to lie, you would make yourself, your friends, or people you respected look good. This is why the criterion of embarrassment counts in favor of an event's historicity. The criterion of embarrassment gives us good grounds to believe the crucifixion of Jesus occurred in 3 different ways. First, John, in John 19, records, quote, "So the soldiers took charge of Jesus, carrying his own cross. He went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on each side, and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fashioned to the cross. It read, 'Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews.' Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, 'Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be the King of the Jews.' Pilate answered, 'What I have written, I have written.' When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. The garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. 'Let's not tear it,' they said to one another. 'Let's decide by lot who will get it.' This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled that said, 'They divided my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment.' So this is what the soldiers did. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there, and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, 'Woman, here is your son,' and to the disciple, 'Here is your mother.' From that time on, this disciple took her into his home." End quote. John chapter 19, verses 16 to 27. John records that 4 women stayed with Jesus during his final hours. Jesus' mother Mary, Jesus' aunt, Mary Magdalene, and Mary the wife of Clopas. There were a lot of women named Mary in the 1st century. The only male disciple that stayed by Jesus' side in his final hours was John. According to Mark's account, the rest of the disciples all ran away in terror when the Romans came to arrest Jesus. See Mark chapter 14, verses 43 to 52. The fact that most of the disciples abandoned Jesus in his darkest hour is not something the gospel writers would have made up. It gets worse when you consider that women are mainly those who stayed behind. In 1st century Jewish culture, women were considered second-class citizens, and Josephus says that they weren't even allowed to witness in a Jewish court of law. More on this in the next video. In light of this, how remarkable it is that it is women who stay by Jesus' side in his final moments rather than the male disciples. If John were making this up, he would have included at least a few other male apostles with him. At least. Yet John puts the women in a good light and most of the men in a bad light. The women are the brave ones and the men are the cowards. Another reason, reason 5, is that Jesus was killed in the most humiliating way. As I said before, if you were making up a story of any kind, you most likely wouldn't depict yourself, your friends, or people you respected in a bad light. The gospel writers, whoever they were, clearly respected Jesus. Why would they make up a story about his death that was considered at that time to be the most degrading and humiliating way to die? I mean, these people didn't just believe that Jesus was their Messiah, but God incarnate. See John chapter 1, verses 1 to 3 and verse 14. Why would you make up a story about your own God that demeans him? Put yourself in the shoes of a first century Jew. If you were going to make up a story of your leader dying and rising, wouldn't you have at least had him killed in a more dignified way? Stoning was one way Jews killed people back in the first century, as we know from the book of Acts, chapter 7, and Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews in book 20 regarding James's martyrdom by stoning. Maybe it's just me, but I think being killed by having a large rock thrown at your head is a far more dignified way to die than being nailed to a stake, either half naked or fully naked. The gospel authors, if they were making up the story of Jesus' death, would have likely have had him die by stoning or some other way. So, once again, the criterion of embarrassment gives us good reason to believe the first minimal fact is true. Reason 6 to believe that Jesus' death by crucifixion is a historical fact is multiple literary form. Remember from the previous video, the criterion of multiple literary forms is if you find an event mentioned in different genres of writing, or different styles of writing, such as miracles, parables, creeds, didactic, Greco-Roman biographies, apocalyptic, etc. And we do find Jesus' death mentioned in different literary forms. The Greco-Roman biographies, those are obvious. Those are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The apocalyptic genre would be in the book of Revelation, in which Jesus shows up in Revelation 5 as a wounded lamb. In creeds, I'll talk about this in a future video, but Jesus' crucifixion is mentioned in the early resurrection creed cited in 1 Corinthians 15 and in the creed cited in Philippians 2. It's mentioned in parables. Jesus' death is told in the parable of the wicked tenants, Luke chapter 20, verses 9 to 16. Didactic. Jesus' crucifixion is mentioned in Peter's sermon in Acts 2. See Acts chapter 2, verse 36. Reason 7. The King of the Jews and the principle of dissimilarity. The criterion of dissimilarity applies here. When the Romans were crucifying Jesus, they nailed a plaque above his head that read, "The King of the Jews." We know that this is historical on the basis of the principle of dissimilarity. The King of the Jews was never a title used for Jesus by the early church. If this title was just made up by the early church and retroactively inserted into the story of Jesus' crucifixion, then we would expect the early church to call Jesus the King of the Jews a lot more frequently than we do. But in fact, the early church never called Jesus by this title. Indeed, Jesus isn't even called the King of the Jews in any other place in the Gospels. Additionally, none of the New Testament epistles call Jesus by this title. Therefore, by the criterion of dissimilarity, we have good reason to believe that this plaque really was nailed above Jesus' head while he was being crucified, which of course entails that Jesus was actually crucified. Reason 8. The criterion of embarrassment again. This time, in Jesus' statement, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" In Matthew 27, Matthew's account of Jesus' death on the cross, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" We can conclude that this is an actual utterance of Jesus on the basis of the criterion of embarrassment. Why would Matthew make Jesus ask God why he has forsaken him? It makes it seem as though Jesus doesn't know why he's being crucified, even though he's recorded as predicting it earlier in Matthew chapter 20, verses 17 to 19. And Jesus even said why he had to die in Matthew 20:28. Why would Matthew make this saying up? It just raises too many questions. Even today, this saying of Jesus strikes people as something odd for him to say. After all, he predicted his death and even explained why it had to take place. So why all of a sudden is he crying out, "Why?" Now, I do think that there is a satisfying explanation for why Jesus said this. It's the first verse of Psalm 22 verbatim. Chapter and verse divisions weren't introduced until around the 3rd century AD, so when someone wanted to point to a particular biblical passage, they would cite the first line, and most biblical scholars consider Psalm 22 to be a prophecy of the way the Messiah would die. When you compare the contents of Psalm 22 with what happened to Jesus in the Gospels, there are striking similarities. I won't go into them in this video, there's not enough time. I'll leave it up to you to look into that yourself. I believe Jesus was calling attention to this psalm in order to get people to realize that he was fulfilling, his very death was fulfilling prophecy. Nevertheless, although an explanation exists for this cry of Jesus, wouldn't it just be easier for Matthew to omit this altogether? Now, at this point, I can imagine a possible objection. A skeptic may rebut, perhaps Matthew included this statement of Jesus precisely because it was the first line of Psalm 22. Matthew was trying to convince his readers that Jesus was the Messiah. So, far from having a motivation to exclude this cry of Jesus's, Matthew would have every reason to put it in there, because it would point people to the Messianic Psalm. And most scholars do believe that Matthew's Gospel was written to a Jewish audience. And Matthew did point out a lot of Messianic prophecies throughout his Gospel. I don't think that this objection mitigates the embarrassment of, my God, why have you forsaken me? And there are a couple of reasons for that. First, in all of the instances in which Matthew points to Jesus fulfilling prophecy, he explicitly refers to the book he's quoting, as the prophet Isaiah said, or as it was written in Jeremiah, or something like that. Matthew doesn't do this here. If he had done that, then that would have mitigated the awkwardness. I think. I mean, I can still imagine someone seeing the Messianic Psalm and thinking, oh gosh, the Old Testament predicted that the Messiah would lose faith in God. So does it really mitigate the embarrassing factor? But secondly, Matthew had other passages to allude to. He could have alluded to Isaiah 53 or Zechariah 12:10. These are far less awkward than Psalm 22, which starts off with a cry that seems to be a lack of faith in God. So I just don't think that this objection that Matthew would have had a motivation because he wanted to convince his readers that Jesus was fulfilling prophecy, I don't think that really has a whole lot of force. Let's summarize what we've looked at so far, what we've seen. We've seen that the historical evidence for Jesus' having been executed via Roman crucifixion is overwhelming. Of the 6 minimal facts that we're going to be looking at in this video series, this one is by far the strongest. Hardly any New Testament scholar, historical Jesus scholar, scholar of ancient Palestine or ancient Israel denies this. The only people who are going to deny this are quacks and Christ mythicists on the internet who don't have any formal training in this field. The agnostic historian Bart Ehrman states that, quote, one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate, end quote. The highly critical scholar of the Jesus Seminar, John Dominic Crossan, writes, quote, that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be, end quote. Like Ehrman, Crossan is not a Christian, yet both Ehrman and Crossan agree that Jesus' death by crucifixion is a historical fact. Now, again, I have to say the reason I'm going to such lengths to establish the death of Jesus is, one, you have to have a death before you can have a resurrection, Secondly, most of the people who are going to be watching this YouTube series are not going to be scholars. They're not going to be academics. They're going to be lay people. And we know most lay people, lay atheists especially, deny that Jesus even existed, much less died. So because this is mostly going to a popular audience, it's very important that we establish this before moving on. But we've seen that the evidence for Jesus' crucifixion is overwhelming.